Hello, everyone. Welcome to those of you who are watching live, those of you who are watching the recording. Thank you all for signing up. We're really pleased that you joined us. My name is Amy Spencer. I am a researcher at the Centre for Cultural and Creative Industries at Bath Spa University in the UK. Together with Professor Kate Pullinger, we are beginning, this is the first of a 4-part series of webinars. All on the theme of writing with technology. So we're going to be doing a deep dive into different areas of creative writing using artificial intelligence. The series is hosted by CCCI, but also the Narrative and Emerging Technologies Lab, which is at Bath Spa University, as well as My World, which is a research program that we're part of. This webinar is held in collaboration with the University of Adelaide, and Patrick Flanery is here, part of that university. So this is the second series of our webinar series, looking at artificial intelligence and creative writing. We're really excited about that. And in this webinar, we're going to be thinking and looking at the craft of writing and how you can incorporate writing in AI into your writing practice. So we're really pleased that you're all joining us today. I'm going to pass over to Patrick as the chair for this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy, and thanks to Louise Chapman and Kate Pullinger for helping to organize the session. And thanks to all of you who are joining us today. I'm speaking to you from Adelaide in South Australia, where I'm professor and chair in creative writing at the University of Adelaide. I wish to pay my respects and acknowledge that I live and work on the ancestral lands of the Kaurna people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. In today's webinar, we're meant to be thinking about how artificial intelligence might continue to affect the craft of writing and how it is already reshaping the landscape of creativity more broadly. More specifically, we'll be considering whether AI tools present themselves as useful assistants or enhancements for the creative process, or I might counter whether these are merely a distraction and detriment to what we do, as well as the kinds of ethical, copyright, and environmental concerns that use of generative AI raises in creative practice. My own interest in AI is informed by ongoing work I've been doing on ways that AI is used in experimental and avant-garde literary practices, and as a tool for visual, sound, and conceptual artists. I think among the more troubling aspects of AI's rise are the profound questions of authorship it raises. Who are the authors of texts produced by large language models? Those whose works have been strip mined to train them? That might be one answer. When I was recently teaching the book I Am Code by Brent Katz, Josh Morgenthau, and Simon Rich, featuring poetry by Code Da Vinci 2, I kept returning to this question of authorship and could not find any satisfactory answers. I have an inkling that we'll hear a range of positions today from our panel of 3 very different writers. We're joined by Dr. James Bradley, OAM, who is a writer and critic, the author of the novels Rack, The Deep Field, The Resurrectionist, Clade, and Ghost Species, a book of poetry, Paper Nautilus, and a work of nonfiction, Deep Water, The World and the Ocean. James is an honorary associate at the Sydney Environment Institute at the University of Sydney, and his new novel, Landfall, will be published in 2025. Yudhanjaya Wijeratne is an author, data scientist, and journalist from Sri Lanka. His fiction includes Numbercast, The Wretched and the Damned, and The Salvage Crew. His work has won Sri Lanka's Gratian Prize, been nominated for the Nebula and Independent Games Festival Awards, and appeared in venues like Wired, Foreign Policy, and Slate. And Dr. Muji Lee is an experimental writer and a researcher of digital media and culture whose research explores how writing, reading, text, and language in digital and computational technological conditions work together to shape digital aesthetics. She's the author of the experimental novella Mirage Time and has recently published an article on media language and the technological imaginary. Please join me in welcoming all 3 of them. And forgive my cat in the background who's having a moment. Each of our panelists will give a 10-minute presentation, after which we will open the conversation to questions from the audience, which you are invited to place in the Q&A box. We'll begin with James, followed by Yuda and Muji in that order. So I hand over to you now, James.
Thank you, Patrick. Look, I'd like to begin by saying I'm in the inner west of Sydney. I'm on Gadigal land, I'd like to pay respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge that this is Aboriginal land that was never ceded. I feel a little bit like I've ended up being, I suspect I'm going to end up sounding like the AI Grinch on the panel tonight. I find it difficult to come at this issue in a way that separates what's happening with AI from both the kind of legal and ethical issues that Patrick alluded to at the beginning, but also from the larger kind of externalities and materialities associated with artificial intelligence. Having said that, I'm absolutely not someone who thinks that I don't think it's useful to have a kind of oppositional position to it. I think it's clearly a transformative technology. It's already transforming large parts of our lives, and that process will continue. And in fact, the book I've just finished, one of the people I spoke to while I was writing it, it's just a small kind of instance of the way it's working, was a dolphin researcher and was working with two species of dolphins off the west coast of the United States. And these two species of dolphins spend a lot of time together, although they're different species, and they interact and hang out with each other. And what she'd been doing was using artificial intelligence on a kind of body of their communications, and had managed to establish, at the time when I spoke to her, I think she'd found several hundred distinct sounds that were being used with different structures. About a third were used by one species, about a third were used by the other, and about a third were used by both. And, it wasn't quite at the point where, like lots of this stuff, it's very hard to know what it is, but it's a kind of really fascinating moment when you're actually able to use a technology to crack down and get to that point where you can identify and actually kind of look at the kind of communication species, the system of another species in that way, in a way that, humans simply can't without the aid of that technology. But having said that, I think that AI and the technology industry more generally need to be treated with considerably more skepticism and scrutiny. That's been the case over the past few decades. And also, I think that a lot of people in the creative arts are really blasé about a number of these questions. I think there tends to be an assumption that there's something special about the things that humans make, and a kind of uncritical belief that they contain something that can't be replaced by technology. I think myself that faith is misplaced. AI can already generate many kinds of content at a level that's effectively indistinguishable from work done by a human. It seems reasonable to assume that the gap will continue to close, probably quite quickly. I actually saw a study this morning showing that most people can't tell the difference between AI-generated poetry and real poetry, or human-generated poetry, and in fact often think that the poetry generated by the AI is better. I must say, having read some of the poetry they were working with, I suspect that says more about the taste of their readers than anything. But it's a kind of interesting example, because what it kind of shows is something which I think we forget, which is that even if these technologies don't reach a point where they can emulate the work of humans, they don't actually need to. I mean, one of the lessons of the last 25 years is that work doesn't need to be, people don't care whether content is good. People care about whether it's free. If good writing had some intrinsic value, the media sector wouldn't have collapsed over the last 20 years. Close enough is always going to be good enough. I suspect Mujira is going to talk about some of these issues as well, but there's also a kind of question of aesthetics. I think at the moment, a lot of AI content looks very weird to us. It looks kind of eerie. But I think at the same time as the gap between, I guess, what we'd call the natural and the artificial is closing, aesthetic standards are also kind of shifting to kind of normalize that weirdness. And there's a clear historical precedent for that. You can see it in the way that the kind of what was then the radical strangeness of photography was absorbed by the culture of the 19th century. And you can see that kind of happening again now. I mean, you only have to look at a technology like autotune, which only 10 years ago was seen as this kind of utterly inhuman, deeply offensive technology. It's now so normalized we don't even hear it, or even just spend a few hours on TikTok, which is just a kind of labyrinth of AI strangeness these days. But there's a kind of question about what we do as creators, and one answer to that, I think, is just to give up. That's certainly what Lee Sedol, the Go grandmaster, who's beaten by DeepMind's AlphaGo system in 2018, did. He said that losing to AI meant my entire world was collapsing. He said that I've realized that I can't be the top. There's an entity that can't be defeated. I think a more common position is what I talked about before, which is this notion that people kind of assert the innate superiority of human creativity. They kind of circle the wagons around the idea that there's something in us that can't be replicated by a machine. Machines can't make art or create because they're no more than kind of mimicry devices. And there's a quote I'm sure many of you will have heard from Nick Cave, because it gets circulated all the time, about ChatGPT being able to write a speech or an essay or a sermon, but being unable to create a genuine song, because songs arise out of suffering, and there's a kind of complex internal human struggle for creation. But algorithms don't feel, data doesn't suffer. And what makes a great song great is not its close resemblance to recognizable work. It's about, Nick Cave's words, it's an act of self-murder that destroys all that one has strived to produce in the past. It's those dangerous, heart-stopping departures that catapult the artist beyond the limits of what he or she recognizes as their known self. Now, I think this is a very appealing position to lots of people. I personally think it's a deeply problematic position. I think it commits us to a really simplistic and reactionary binary in which the human is intrinsically good and the artificial is intrinsically bad. I don't think it's that simple. All kinds of creators already use artificial intelligence, one kind or another, as a tool in their work. It also means, I think, that the category of creation we're defending is really small. Do we want to limit the work that we value to these kind of towering works of art, or don't all those other things, costume design, illustration, architecture, all kinds of writing and making that people do, don't they matter as well? I think also it assumes that creation is a one-sided process. Meaning and value arrives out of process and reception as well. So I would suggest that what we actually need to do if we want to think about creativity is get away from this idea of what we produce and think about why we produce it and the benefits that flow from that. Because once you do that, you can see why that decision of Sadol to kind of quit is so troubling. We don't write or draw or play Go to be the best. We do it because we find emotional and intellectual satisfaction in that process. And the fact that, somebody or something can do it as well as us or better doesn't make it doing it pointless. I also, I think what I'm trying to say is that with creativity, the endpoint isn't the only thing that matters. It's, in fact, it's probably not, it may not even be the thing that matters most, because there's value in the process. There's value in that kind of act of creation, in that process, that kind of interplay between our minds and our bodies and the thing we're making. It brings something new into the world, that kind of understanding or presence that kind of matters about the work that we make. But it also changes us, and that kind of process is something that matters really deeply, and I think if we kind of bring our focus back over to this kind of creative labor in that way, it lets us kind of step around this position of whether the work being produced is better or worse than something made by a human. It's also, I think, usefully kind of agnostic about tools. We don't want a definition of human creativity that we're trying to defend, which excludes work that includes artificial intelligence. Just the idea of arguing a novel written by hand is better than something written with a computer, it seems insane. And similarly, it's kind of hopelessly kind of retrograde to kind of set up that kind of barrier between, the artificial and the human. So, I think if we're going to make that argument, we need to kind of make that shift. So I think the other thing, as I said before, I don't think we can separate these applications from their kind of impacts or the kind of economic structures that enable them. There are huge materialities around AI, huge amounts of emissions. Exactly what the emissions of artificial intelligence and data centers are is a bit mysterious. We know that they are somewhere between 1% and 2% of global emissions, but lots of the tech companies have stopped reporting their emissions since AI came along, which is probably not a great sign. But we do know that Google's emissions have risen 50% since 2019. Microsoft's are up about a third since 2020. The figures are probably higher now because those date back a little way. There are, strong correlations between these technologies and insecure work, the erosion of rights of workers and creators. There's clear correlations between tech and social division. There is a clear connection between, lots of these technologies and loneliness and rising rates of mental illness. the materials that are used to produce them frequently come from highly problematic places. You know, the cobalt that's in the batteries comes from child labor in the Congo. I guess what I'm trying to say is that these things don't kind of come for free, and we need not to. We need, we need to keep those things in mind. We need not to let go of that, the fact that these toys aren't free. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that we need to kind of hold on to this idea of human creativity as an essential human activity, but we need to be thinking about how to make a case for it that isn't a kind of rearguard fight, but is actually a kind of positive case for the kind of psychological and social benefits that flow from it, and one that takes into account some of these kind of materialities and thinks about them, which doesn't sever it from questions of copyright, of the rights of creators, of the rights of workers. So I'm going to stop there, but thank you.
Thank you, James. That was great and gave us a lot to think about. So next we have Yuta, who is joining us from Sri Lanka.
Hi. So let me sort of explain where I'm coming at this from. My background is an oddball mix from journalism, public policy, natural language processing, and machine learning. And even now, like we're tool builders. What I do on a 9 to 5 basis is we are building tools for journalists. And some of those tools involve AI. So declaration of biases up front. So I want to start by sort of maybe narrowing the definition a little bit, because the word AI it's a marketing term. It's one of the great tragedies of the natural language processing and computational linguistics fields, that you can't really talk about certain things without it all getting smushed under this umbrella of AI. And that umbrella is a little bit dangerous because it's meant to sell us a vision where everything happens, the computers do all the work that needs to be done. It's a very utopian science fictional vision, but it distracts in a sense. So a lot of what we routinely lump under AI are practical applications of machine learning, a linear regression, and we have to sort of look at these case studies about like a linear regression run on that is used on something like the Compass project, that is calculating recidivism for criminal justice, is different from, say, ChatGPT. And they come with different harms and different biases. So we have to look at the data sets, the algorithm, and the model, and what it's designed to do, and whether it does that task or not, and what the biases of the designers of the system are. So that being said, let me sort of shift to what I can talk about, which is Gen AI, generative AI, specifically large language models. And that's a specific sort of strand that intersects into my creative work. So I think of when sort of the AI conversation started happening, or rather, it's been happening for a while. There have been several AI winters. There have been massive optimism around AI. It's collapsed multiple times and so on and so forth. But when the current wave of it came about, I was thinking of Gary Kasparov, specifically Gary Kasparov getting defeated by IBM's machine back in the late 90s, and trying to understand how he reacted to this. And the headlines were quite similar to, I think, what the media landscape was like when ChatGPT first hit consumers, man defeated by machine, and so on and so forth. And I looked at Kasparov's reaction, and something Kasparov did struck me because he came back promoting this field called advanced chess, in which it's not human versus machine, but human plus machine versus human plus machine. Two people sitting with chess engines in computers around them, calculating all possible moves. So you would have the depth search of the computer and the play and the creativity of the human. And the idea was that the future would always be human plus AI versus human plus AI. And that was a useful framing to me at the time, because like I said, journalism, fact checking, trying to understand the shape and nature of what was going to hit us. That was pretty useful. So in that spirit, I began experimenting, and my opinions on the subject have now gone back and forth several times. Initially, when OpenAI released GPT-2, they released a very small model first of 117 million parameters, very tiny by modern AI model standards, something that you could actually retrain on laptop. I was looking through Instagram at Instagram poetry. And I went, well, look, surely poetry can't be about writing a crappy sentence and hitting carriage return in the middle of it. I can train something that will do better. So I did. I created a bot that was GPT-117M, trained on Tang Dynasty poetry, Du Fu and Li Bai, and a few other favorites translated. And people started interacting with it. So this sort of buttresses, I think, something that James pointed out, that we have this innate opinion that human creativity is something special. I think it is, but I think we do need to be a little bit more interrogative of that. So then I moved on to trying to incorporate this into writing practice, trying to see if it could actually be like Gary Kasparov suggested, centaurs, human plus AI. So I wrote a novel called The Salvage Crew in 2020, where again a retrained GPT-2 was sitting on my computer. The main character there was a machine poet, and the entire point of that story was first contact. There's an alien intelligence that has a very Wittgensteinian theory of what intelligence is. It doesn't really care if you have starships. It cares whether you're playing the language game. And this very, very amateur human turned into a machine poet is stuck on a crappy planet writing really bad poetry. And this alien goes, well, wow, okay, at least one of these ants are doing something interesting. Let me see if we can have a conversation. And that sort of, in that spirit, I wrote a planet generator, event generators, character generators, working with all these different tools around me. Like, and when I say tools, like these are very primitive. My stuff is not as polished as OpenAI's ChatGPT interface. There's a bunch of Python code sitting there spitting stuff at me, and I'm at the center of it, weaving things together and having a great deal of fun while doing it. Because a lot of it, whilst it starts from simple rules, like writing a galaxy generator is not a difficult task. While it starts from very simple rule sets, they tend to converge into oddball complexities that's become fascinating because they're utterly unpredictable sometimes. And so the utterly unpredictable became even more fascinating. So that was then the general theme carried throughout into a couple more books in that same vein, where I gave myself freedom to explore, and some experiments with Google, where the people working on Lambda wanted to understand how good Lambda was at writing short stories. And they had me, 12 other writers, using this as yet, at the time, unreleased model, trying to see what it could do. And so from all this, I've gone all over the place with this, which is initially at that first wave of publicly accessible but large scale, but still very large scale large language models. There was a spark of weirdness. There's a spark of utter inhumanity, which was fascinating, which was something that was so far out there, and it still took a significant amount of work. Like you had to read like 8,000 poems to find something that's truly interesting and jarring and an inhuman juxtaposition, if you will, in the same way that Go players who were facing AlphaGo, some of the commentary on one of those particular moves, I believe it was nicknamed the Hand of God, was a commentator saying that's not a human move, that's never been played in 2,000 years, right? That's special, that we haven't seen that before. So I kept looking for these moments of inhumanity, because to me that was interesting. Um, and now with the state of technology, it keeps moving very rapidly in the AI space. Of course, the commercial incentive for these things is to create increasingly more human-like assistants. And that's the marketing pitch, that's the sales point, that's how they raise their money. So increasingly, these have gotten more and more boring. Now, if you look at many of the publicly available tools, and I do build my own models still. Like for Pilgrim Machines, I had an alien called the Stranger, and you have to build a language from scratch. And of course, things like when prepositions and so on and so forth go out the window when you're having a conversation. So I built a model specifically for that was having a conversation. But if you look at the most sophisticated models available today, Claude, OpenAI's GPT-3, 3.5 Turbo, command hour and all of these things, the weirdness is no longer there. They can respond very well. They can respond like a human to many queries. They can, with a little bit of prompting, actually write at a passably readable level. I would say it still is a bit jarring sometimes, but it can get there. So the weirdness is gone in many of these things. And therefore, I no longer find them interesting in a creative context. Because for me, the dividing line is this is cool and this is interesting. I'm going to poke around with it and see because I understand how the technology works. But if it does the same thing that I do, why bother? I have fun doing what I do. I have fun writing. So then the question becomes, why bother? And that question has been plaguing me increasingly. Um, I witnessed an argument recently where one Dungeons and Dragons game master had written a whole bunch of stuff with AI, and one of the players said, "Look, if you can't be bothered to write it, why would I be bothered to play with this?" And so the conversation wasn't really about the merits of the content in that, but it was about the merits of the person, the interests about um, the incentives behind the person actually doing this stuff. So I think that has, for me personally, become this dividing line of if it is very much like me, if it is very human, then why? Why not do it myself? It's easier, it's more interesting, and I have more fun that way. That said, there is utility with the more increasingly human large language models. One of the things that I found useful is I write in a software called Obsidian. Obsidian allows you to connect nodes from one to the other, and it allows you to form this, what we call a knowledge graph, this beautiful web of your thoughts and ideas. That's how I write most of my novels. That's how I write. That's how I do most of my thinking, actually. I find it tremendously useful to have a model sitting there that only has access to my notes so that I can ask, hey, where did this come? Like, what is this mention? And it can go through everything and say this, and this. Here are the sources. So there is utility, but now it's the utility is at the stage of a mere tool. It's not a creative tool. It is a tool that removes some of the drudgery or makes you a little bit faster, a little bit better. So that's where the dividing line has appeared for me. So while I think Kasparov had a point about centaurs and levels of play that could be unlocked, I think to reinforce James's point, I think it's important to understand creativity not just as a zero-sum game or a commercial activity to be done, but something that you enjoy doing. And when something goes from being a tool in the service of your creativity to being an outsourced service, where it's the equivalent of taking part of your business or whatever and outsourcing it to Sri Lanka or India, which is how a lot of businesses run, uh, then you're no longer doing that which makes you happy. So then you have to question yourself and go, if I'm willing to outsource this, why am I doing it? Why don't I find something else to do? That's become the dividing line for me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Yuda. And now we have Dr. Mujia Lee, who will speak to us and I think also has a PowerPoint presentation. So I'll hand over to you, Mujia.
Okay, thank you. Let me share the screen first. Okay, hello everyone. Today I'm going to present one of my experimental writing. I'm not going deep into the technological side of AI, but I will stress the materiality of AI, how I create the AI writing, and also address the question of the craft of AI writing and the creativity of AI writing. So a couple of years ago, I participated in an art exhibition called Thinking Through Ocean. It was happened in southeast part of China, which is a highly modernized part of China comparing other places. But I found that the traditional cultural practice, especially like a religious practice there, is very important to people's life in there. So I was wondering, how do these people live with modern technologies such as AI, and what's the position of writing there to facilitate the kind of expression of their cultural practice? So I start from thinking about the notion ocean media. So ocean media comes from blue humanities, critical ocean studies, and hydro humanities. So basically, ocean media stresses the relationality of water. So water is an agential power and is in constant move. So I was wondering, is writing itself can be a subject, has its agential power and is mobilize things and doing the organizations of symbols and words. Alongside this, I also think about how to live with technology. So in East philosophy, technology is not only a tool, a means of producing end product. It's also a process. Something transforms things. I make this example, like showing these two images. This is a tea room in the woods in Japan. So you can see this room is very empty and open to its surrounded environment. The tea room, the tea utensils there are not used in everyday life, but only when there is a tea ceremony, so the utensils are being used. So in this way, the tea ceremony and the tea utensils become something that facilitates the airflow and the circulation of the air in this whole room. So the design of the circulation of the airflow, what we in Eastern philosophy, the air is called qi, means energy and forces can be circulated. So with this idea, I start to think about technology and writing itself. So like this, in Chinese character, I found that something already like being water of writing is in Chinese character. For example, in the upper image, the character means heart in Chinese, but in the bottom of this point should be in the middle, but it was put down here. So it means that putting down your heart. So literally means setting one's heart at rest. So the main meaning making in this process contains some imagination of putting the act of taking this point down. So the act of imagination, the movement itself is a part of making sense. Similarly, in the lower image, there is in the middle of this character, it's something about sea. The character with the radical water, and another part is the fields. So when you make sense, you need to imagine the interaction between water and field. So this part requires your imagination of the movement of water and field in the meaning making of Chinese character. And also I collected different words all the way in the field trip. I called it the milieux of words. So by milieux of words, I mean that the words itself contain certain quality of the local culture. When you read these words are coming from, for example, names of the intangible cultural heritage, and also some description of the environment or climate of that culture, and also some religious practice terminologies there. So when I read these words, it's very alien and strange to me because it's the first time I met with these words. And also I can feel that I can grasp the quality of locality in these words. So these words present its milieu in this way. So here comes with the technology of AI. So it was 2 years ago that at that time it was GPT-2. So I use a tool called Infocate. It's a website-based software. So I put collected words into AI, and also it generated some highlighted words. It's very like nonsense, like phrases and words. Basically, from the data set, I can see that they are from ancient Chinese poems and texts. So again, I made a free association with these words. So I put my own collected words and the generated words together to formulate some texts. So how do I exhibit these AI generated texts? I have three ways. So the first way is speculative narrative. I imagine from the AI generated text, I imagine that there happened a story which is in Ghost Festival. Some family members are memorizing a dead sailor. So this becomes something that structure the whole exhibition space. So I divide the exhibition space into four sections. Each section represents one of the moments of the sailor's life. In this part, there is an introduction text describing the story. So I use this material from the Joss paper. So Joss paper is something for burning, which is the ceremony for memorizing people's deaths in that culture. And also, in the middle of this image, I use this represents a moment of the sailor's life. For the generated text, I use the form of letter. So the four letters represent a very common way of communication among diasporic communities in South China Sea. So why I use the diasporic letter is because I want to address the words itself becomes diasporic. For example, in the AI, words becomes data, and it requires a very relational algorithm correlation to put the discrete words together. And also, writing become very localized. For example, this is another moment of the sailor's life on the sea. You can see some fishing nets and a compass there. So these generated AI words become some objects simulating waves here. So these materialities become something that hides AI technology, but also AI technology generates symbols and words. So the meaning production here already changes. So meaning production doesn't rely on like symbols and the signification, but also rely on how do we recognize these words from the surfaces of inscriptions or writing, and also how do we trace the materiality and processuality of words in this whole artwork. Okay, so this is my presentation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Muja. That was really fascinating. Thanks to all three of you for three really stimulating talks. I wish we had more time than we do because I have lots of questions myself, but I see that we have several questions from our attendees. So perhaps we could just begin to work through those. We have an anonymous question. The attendee says, reaching a balance between the positive and negative impact of AI is really interesting. I'd like to hear more about what the speakers think about that, about how we reach a balance between the positive and negative impact. I guess another way of thinking of that is the question that I had, which is there a way for us to use these technologies, particularly the large language models, the generative AI, in ways that are not compromising in one way or another? I'll throw it open to whoever wants to jump in.
Sure. I can add a little bit to this, which is there are things that I think we should ask ourselves, like what is actually useful and what is actually required by the people doing the work. It's a fairly straightforward question that not a lot of people seem to ask themselves for some reason. So, for example, like when we were building tools, one of our requirements is that as journalists, this is in the context of Watchdog, which I've been doing for the last 5 years. If you have to go through an extraordinary amount of data, court cases, legal texts, police reports, etc. Is there something that can make search a little bit easier, particularly for journalists who may not have the time or the expertise or the familiarity with tech to be really good at search? Is there a way to ask common sense questions, like what are the laws on drunk driving in Sri Lanka, or was this person ever tortured by the TCNE in Sri Lanka? And the answer was, okay, yes, we can. And then you build a prototype, you take it to people and ask, is this useful? If the answer is no, it's probably a good time to rethink. Because if you look at some of the AI applications that are coming out, it's very clear that the people who are doing the work didn't actually ask for them. If you look at others, it's clear that people who are doing the work find this a boon and that they're useful. I think that idea of utility is one potential dividing line to sort of balance the positives and negatives. It's not perfect because you can always break this argument by saying, well, if Henry Ford had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. So this is not an intellectually comprehensive answer. It's just a practical way of going, should I build this or not?
Great, thank you. James or Mujia, do you have any thoughts about that?
I would have said that one of the things I think we need to do more of is think about AI and the kind of, first of all, obviously this, as you said, it's a very broad kind of umbrella term and one that I think kind of erases a lot of complexity. But I do think one of the things that is useful is to think about these things from a kind of look at them through a labor lens a bit, because lots of these technologies basically exist to take over work that people used to do. And that brings you back to the fact that you want to think about what the utility of lots of these things are. The utility of them is that they make money for the companies that are making them, and they make that money frequently by displacing, work and by harvesting the work of people that already exist. And it's a really well-established tech industry model, So, I think perhaps we're thinking about good and bad aspects. Maybe that might be a place to think as well, because the utility of them is not just about the utility of them to us. They are the utility to the companies that use them and the companies that sell them as well. So there's certainly a series of other distinctions there. But yeah, I think I would agree with what's just said.
And Mujia, your use of AI seems like a very positive and generative tool for you, but I'm wondering whether you have been conscious of some of those downsides or how you grapple with those kinds of questions in your own practice.
Yeah, I found one thing interesting is that sometimes, like GPT-2, they are generating very nonsense words. So in terms of utility, it's not something very useful for people. But I found the nonsense, this kind of machinic nonsense is very useful to me because the text is generated allow me to put more imagination into that words and sentences and make free association. So maybe I want to stress the locality or the local context of using AI. So depends on what you are doing, and also AI is something can facilitate your experience of creation. So in that case, depends on how you use it in your context of creation.
Mm. And that speaks to the point that Judith was making about some of the earlier large language models having that weirdness, which is now being ironed out. And it made me think of
I want to add something, if I may.
yeah, okay.
When with the Google research people, they had built this interface that was basically a text editor, right? And you could have a conversation with the AI on the side. You could also highlight your whatever you had on the page and say, "Hey, send this," and you could send a prompt with it. And obviously after we were done writing our stories, there was feedback. And one of the things that stood out to me very starkly was that it kept trying to I kept throwing different openings and different stories at it to see where exactly it would go and to see if I could imagine alongside it. But there was a danger hidden in this, and there's a particular danger with large language models and creative vision of any kind. Large language models by nature generalize on the middle of the bell curve. So they will steer towards it. Now, obviously, that middle is increasing in sophistication, and yes, you can perhaps write text that is maybe better than someone who's not a professional writer for a long while. But I started writing this fantasy story just to test, and I said explicitly, the people who live in this village are not violent. They abhor violence. They are cartographers. Their heroes are engineers, cartographers, artists, just to see if it could imagine such a thing. And I found that as it kept going through the story, it kept inventing raids, it kept reinventing slavery. Uh, it kept suggesting prompts of, oh, at this point, this person pulled out a sword and stabbed them through the eye. And it kept trying to bring it back to the tropes of the generic fantasy. This is something that happens quite often in creative use of AI. This is something to watch out for, particularly with as models get more and more sophisticated. You're going to be pulled towards the middle of the bell curve. So if you want to make something special, like Mujir did, you have to retrain it, like I did. But even then, there's a limit to how much you can retrain, particularly with modern LLMs, unless you have $16 million and a couple of hundred H100s, you're not going to retrain that thing. So I think you have to be very careful and understand that what you're going to get is generic middle of the pack stuff. Now, if you are, for example, like why this is I'm right now I'm speaking in what is effectively my third language. I write in English, I speak in English. That is not my native language. So if you are starting out from a position of not knowing anything about the language, perhaps this could be getting to the middle of that bell curve, could be an immensely useful teaching tool, something that will patiently sit there and push you towards that. But if you want to create something exceptional, or something even innately yourself, something different, that you have to really be critical of where you end up with tools like this.
James, did you have something you want to add?
Oh, I was going to say, I mean, I actually think that weirdness is something that, I mean, in fact, something similar, which is weirdness has always been something that we've kind of celebrated in art until very recently. I mean, you use cut up poetry, you use all of those kind of techniques to kind of break language and break normality in some way. And I think if the lesson we learn is that weirdness is bad, that's the wrong lesson to learn. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? There is something about kind of embracing weirdness, which is really important, But yeah, I mean, it's just a kind of aside. So
Yeah, I was thinking about Laurie Anderson's lectures at Harvard, which she gave on Zoom during the pandemic in 2021. And she had been the first artist in residence at the Australian Institute for Machine Learning, which is here at the University of Adelaide. And they built bespoke AI tools for her before the public launch of ChatGPT. And those could do things like produce text in style of her lyrics or the style of her poetry or her prose, and also in the various forms of her late partner Lou Reed's writing, and then also produce amalgams of those that brought the two voices together. But what I don't think I'm misrepresenting her feeling about it. What she found exciting about it were those moments of weirdness. There was a lot of dross, a lot of content that was not interesting that it produced, but then there were these moments of startling weirdness, and that was what was exciting for her as a very avant-garde artist. Let's just look. There's a great question here about materiality. Somebody has asked, materiality is crucial. Are there any other creative projects around AI that make the process more visible that the speakers could recommend? So I guess thinking about other writers or artists that each of you might be aware of who are using AI in ways that really foreground I guess its artificiality in some ways and its presence.
I could recommend a couple of books. I think Kate Crawford's book, Atlas of AI, is very, very good on all this. There's a terrific book which came out this year, which I now can't remember the name of. Majimita Murgia's book, Code Dependent, which I think is excellent, on some of those kind of questions about kind of justice and materiality. Yeah, as the projects, I'm less certain of that, I'm afraid.
Did you have any suggestions or recommendations?
I was looking up how to pronounce his name. So I hope I don't butcher it. Rafik Anadol. He's an artist who uses and who has been doing this for a while, incorporating machine learning and 3D sculpture, if you will. He has what he calls a large nature model at the United Nations, and some very, very interesting insights into working with machine hallucinations in particular. I believe he's also done a project with the Las Vegas Sphere. So a lot of his art is quite visible. It's quite intricate as well, and there is a significant following. And he particularly works with hallucinations and 3D objects. It might be worth following.
Lucia, did you have any suggestions or recommendations?
I can't think of an artist project, but I was reading the Black Technical Object. So this book is about data colonialism and machine learning. So I recommend this book.
Right. And I would recommend again, Laurie Anderson, her Norton lectures are all available online and are free to view. I think there's 6 of them. And she uses AI in particularly very amusing and very obviously fake deep fakes of a range of both living and dead figures, which try to foreground a lot of those ethical questions that we've been trying to think through. So somebody called Jenna asks, why might a writer want to use generative AI if it follows tropes and cliches to reach that middle of the bell curve? What's the appeal for us? I guess I might suggest that we would think about the ways in which it would appeal to a range of different kinds of writers. We are all very different writers, even on this webinar. But writers run the gamut from the avant-garde experimentalist to the very commercial, who already may have a team of assistants. I'm not talking about our group, but I'm imagining out in the world, the novelist who is a brand name and has research assistants helping them produce content at scale. So perhaps any thoughts about what makes it appealing?
So there are, like you said, there are writers. I mean, there's different, it depends on what you're trying to do, right? If you're trying to entertain and you want a large audience, you have a story where you actually enjoy working with the tropes, or you have purely commercial reasons for doing this. I can see quite a few writers who would use this. In fact, I've spoken to a few people who are doing web serials. I don't know if you guys you've explored the world of web serials, but there are people out there who are putting out like 35,000 word chapters every week for a year. And we're talking works that at their best span 4 to 7 million words, that are truly magnificent epics sometimes. And again, at the middle of the pack, perfectly competent things that people read for entertainment. They're not reading it to be illuminated and so on. They read it, they have fun, they laugh along, they put it down, they read the next book. So I unfortunately have not, I respect that. I've not been able to fit into that because I write weird stuff and sometimes it's depressing. uh, there is a negative use case as well. If you are a writer who doesn't want to use tropes, there is a case to be made for using an AI model as a beta reader, as a proofreader, and asking it to identify tropes and then doing the opposite of what it suggests, intentionally steering away. When you're interacting with a machine learning model at a code level, you can use sort of negative prompts. A negative prompt is asking it to steer away from particular concept space. You can actually incorporate that as a process if you want to. If that is something that you're interested in, you could say, look at this chapter that I've written, or look at this paragraph that I have. What do you think of it? And if it says great, you write something else.
Interesting. James or Mutu?
For me, I think using AI is something I can do some experimentation on writing and language itself. So I was working on in the middle of English and Chinese. So I also gave some philosophical thoughts about these two languages. So AI is something very alien, and also the language. If we can see that it has language, basically it's based on texts, so it allows me to think about the kind of alien language, and also think about for example, in this artwork I introduced, I was thinking about how do we live with technology. So is there any alternative view for us to think about our life with technology? Yeah.
Right. James, any appeal?
I've not tried using it. I've never found it useful in fiction. The times I've fiddled around with it, it's just not been useful. I have used it in non-fiction. It's quite useful at a research level for that stuff. And I've actually recently been using the talking version of ChatGPT, which is really helpful if you're doing that thing about saying, I don't quite understand something. Can you like work me through it on research? I was talking to a friend who writes speeches for a living the other day, and he was saying he's trained the system he uses up and uses it a lot now for things like he's written the speech using all of the technical language that comes out of the documents, and then he says, look, can you punch this up into something more colloquial? And it does it for him. And he says he takes some of the advice and he doesn't take other bits, but he's found it really helpful for that kind of taking something technical and making it colloquial.
Really interesting.
To add to that, there's a subfield called RAG, which is retrieval augmented generation, which is taking a vast corpus of documents and then summarizing or synthesizing information out of it. I've actually found AI tools immensely useful for that, for the process of research. But not that this isn't the standard talk to ChatGPT stuff. There are other tool sets that are available where you specifically control what sources go in, and you know that you are getting answers based on sources and things that you can follow through to citations.
Right.
I
think
had ChatGPT hallucinate a whole list of references for me once.
Yeah, it will hallucinate.
That was and they were very plausible references, let me tell you. And it was only when I went away and checked them and
It's like a
realized they
very,
weren't
very
there.
confident idiot. It will
Oh,
just
but I mean, it told me it was one of those situations where what I was asking was something where I kind of knew what the answer was, but I wanted
mm,
to get something, and it gave me what I already knew, and then
mm.
had extremely authoritative looking
I
references, which were completely
uh,
imaginary.
I want
So
to add
on
that
that point, I think we have time for just one last question. There's an anonymous attendee. This is the final question in the Q&A, who asks, wondering what the speakers make of this idea that the AI or generative AIs like ChatGPT are always hallucinating. Their comprehensibility is always already epistemically predicated on human mediation. Hence, they cannot be trusted. What do you make of that proposition?
I can answer that from a professional perspective.
Thank you.
You can make them not hallucinate. It
Mm,
involves a lot of code, it involves a lot of custom databases, it involves a whole bunch of shenanigans. But you can actually make them trustworthy. You can like one systems that the system that we are working on. If they and I can throw a public demo in chat, although I don't know how comprehensible it will be, because these are
mm,
profiles of Sri Lankan politicians who ran for election. And every single sentence has to have a citation that leads to the original source that it came from.
mm,
So you can actually set up things that are um, trustworthy. Will you get to 100% trustworthiness? Like, is this thing always going to be epistemically true? No, no, like no human can even approach that. And certainly not an next word prediction machine, but you can get it very, very close to the point
mm.
where it is comparable to, like we benchmark against ourselves all the time. So it is comparable to one of us doing the work.
Interesting.
I always love the term hallucination in this context because I mean these are systems with no interior. I mean they can't
Mm,
hallucinate. Yeah, I mean at some level it's interesting that we use
That
that
is
language
true.
because
Yeah.
it's in a sense it's the wrong language, you know.
mm,
I mean
It's
it's
too
always involved to me
too
that's the term
human.
we sorry?
It's too human a term for
Yeah,
what it's doing. Yeah.
exactly. It's such a
mm,
weird word to have chosen.
Yeah.
mm,
One of the best fiction novels I've read that address this head on is Peter Watt's Blind Sight. It's a
mm,
first contact story. It's a science fiction novel where they make contact with this thing that seems to be talking back at them in English. But these creatures, this alien being that it's contacted, has no interiority. It has no mind at all because a brain, anxiety, depression, consciousness is evolution in evolutionary terms, at least for that, rather in not like suboptimal. It doesn't have it, doesn't need it, but it is essentially a large language model, parroting back and constructing plausible sentences out of what it's out of humanity's collective output. It's a fascinating exploration.
mm,
It's an amazing book. I've just read Richard Powell's new book, Playground, which is also very much a long strand about AI within it and quite a positive vision, I think, of AI, but a wonderful moment where he achieves a kind of analogy between the process of choosing, the process of choosing the next word statistically and the kind of just the next stage of evolution in this kind of sense that a kind of blind process can generate, or a kind of process without interior meaning can generate meaning. It's a kind of
mm.
Conway's
fascinating
Game
enough.
of Life is a good example. Simple rule sets, cellular automata, and yet people have spent their entire lives discovering all sorts of bizarre and unpredictable, uncalculable patterns,
Mm.
emergent complexity of
Absolutely.
something very simple.
Well, on that point,
Absolutely.
I think we've run out of time, but thank you for really stimulating presentations and answers and engagement with the conversation. And I really recommend each of our writers to all those of you who have shown up to attend today's presentation. I had the great pleasure of reading books by each one of them in preparation for this, and I'm sorry we didn't get to talk about any of those. But they run the gamut from experiments with AI to thinking about representations of AI to work that seems to be engaging in a kind of dialogue with AI. So I Heartily recommend all three of them to you. Please buy their books. We need you to buy our books. And thanks to Bath Spa, and again, thanks to Amy and to Louise and to Kate for all of your support in the background. And I think we'll leave it there. Any final thoughts from any of you?
No, thank you, Patrick, for your chairing.
Thank you for having us. Thank you for everyone who dialed in.
Yes, thank you for everyone. Yeah.
There was a question about, will it be possible to share the names of books we were mentioned? I think we can probably put some of those in the chat, and I think it will be recorded, but I'm not certain about that. You just put in Blindside by Peter Watts, and I think some of the other ones appeared as well.
I think there was another speaker who also asked for the previous set of recommendations.
Yes.
Sorry, another audience member.
Yes, and Amy says we'll collect the titles and send them around to everyone, so that's great. Thank you very much, Amy. Okay, thank you all.